The Star Trek universe is full of time travel episodes, not to mention contradictions within its own canon timeline. And what we have today is a look at this weird and wacky world of the Prime universe. Maybe some Kelvin thrown in. Stick around, subscribe, like, comment, and I'm trek.trav. So the problems in Star Trek timeline didn't just begin with Discovery or Strange New Worlds or the Kelvin timeline films. They've been there all along. For example, Gene Roddenberry had a tendency to pick and choose what he thought was canon. For example, Star Trek, the original series, season 3, of which had some horrendous episodes, including an episode where women can't be captains, and there's a lot of sexist statements. So a lot of those things which were not, one of those things were progressive back in the day, very much not frowned upon right now. In terms of TNG, we had a lot of things. They didn't really mention the original series, but it was pushed way in front in the timeline. Another example of a changing timeline is in Star Trek V, we get introduced to Spock's brother, Cyborg, of whom had never been mentioned before, who had never been mentioned again until Strange New Worlds.
You ordered me to kill my brother.
But the man may be a fellow Vulcan, but that doesn't...
No, Captain, you do not understand. Cyborg also is a son of Sarek.
You mean he's your brother? You made that up.
I did not.
You did too. Cyborg couldn't possibly be your brother because I happen to know for a fact you don't have a brother.
Kind of like Michael Burnham showing up. We didn't know about her, she'd never been mentioned, she'd never been discussed. What was going on? We have a lot of time travel within Star Trek, of which adjusts the Star Trek timeline. Recently in Strange New Worlds, we had an episode where the Romulan informant, and it was in the earlier part of Strange New Worlds, talking about how the time keeps shifting to try and get to a certain point. So no matter how much they tried to stop Khan, he kept coming back.
Have tried to influence these events, or to delay them or stop them. I mean, whole temporal wars have been fought over them. And it's almost as if time itself is pushing back and events reinsert themselves, and all this was supposed to happen back in 1992, and I've been trapped here for 30 years trying to get my shot at him.
So the writers have a troubled thing going on. Keeping the show based in our reality means that things from the original series which were stated about now, and Deep Space Nine will have that next year when we have the Bell riots, they're not explained in a special way. But in this episode, they finally sort of talk about the fact that the Prime timeline has been shifting because of the time travel interference from the temporal Cold War. But what this means, and ultimately what the show's trying to tell you, is that every time there's an interaction or a change or an interference in the timeline, the Star Trek universe itself slightly adjusts, which is a really interesting concept and a really clever way to go, look, there might be some inconsistencies, but that's because the timeline's been changed. Now you might sit there and go, yeah, but the original series had time travel episodes and What it means is, on a timeline, is that every time from the original series through to Strange New Worlds and Lower Decks, when they slightly interfere with time, it changes the timeline. So technically, in order to get the proper story of Star Trek, you have to watch from Star Trek TOS all the way through to Strange New Worlds, because those time travel episodes change things, little things, big things, things that you wouldn't necessarily think were a changeable thing. For example, how the Klingons look, or an example is how the Enterprise looks much more advanced in Strange New Worlds than it does in the original series, how the Borg were in the original timeline of Star Trek Enterprise. They pop up in there, and how Picard was in the first contact with the Vulcans. Those things adjusted the timeline. The Borg were not a part of the timeline until Star Trek First Contact. So in order for the timeline change to be recognized, it had to be it had to be a change within the episode. For example, Voyager constantly changing in time, and Voyager having the fight with the Krenim. These episodes didn't only affect the series and the episodes they were in, they affected the previous series. So when we go back and things are being referenced, such as the Eugenics War and such as World War III, those things might have been adjusted and changed. And it's a really amazing how they took an episode focused on La'an getting thrown in an alternate timeline by a time agent and turned it into an episode that was about the Star Trek universe as a whole. And we get to see Khan, who is finally a Sikh warrior, well, finally a Sikh boy, a South Asian child, instead of whatever Benedict Cumberbatch was doing. Now, how is this Prime universe different from just having a Kelvin universe, which is a completely different timeline? So I would think of it kind of like having a rock in a pond. You would have, if you threw a rock in a pond, the ripples would go out and they would dissipate over time and things would go back to normal. Whereas the Kelvin timeline is kind of more like a stream that comes off the main timeline. It's like someone's they've thrown a boulder down there which limits them and forces the water down another stream. So it's a different timeline. The Star Trek Kelvin timeline might end up completely different to the Star Trek Prime timeline and different from the Mirror universe, which are alternate universes, not alternate timelines. They've had their differences. And I think this is it's a really clever way. So we've got multiverse theory, we've got changing time, we've got time theory and time travel theory. It's a really clever and interesting topic, which means that basically they can make little nicks and changes. Like I'm sure that the Gorn are going to be a major villain within Strange New Worlds. And I'm sure that the relationship between Spock and Chapel is something that wasn't really investigated. There was definitely a relationship between the two in TOS, but this is a fully fledged relationship that we will see. And it's good and it allows a little bit of freedom, not changing the big points, but allowing smaller points to be adjusted and tweaked so that the narrative can fit together in these newer programs. I find this idea, personally, the best thing they've done in Star Trek for a long while. I think the Kelvin timeline was a good choice, moving it out of the main one, so you could have all the recognizable characters and you had your IP fresh and ready to go without the baggage of the past. Whereas this is taking what we've already established and saying, look, those things did happen, just not maybe as you remember them or maybe as the crew has said before. It's really clever. I'd love you to tell me what you think about the time and space and wacky universes of Star Trek. And like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you on Thursday for Strange New Worlds musical episode.